What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Other Guys on the Badlands Podcast Network. I'm Dick Chatsky, joined as always by Paul Clegalen. We are kicking off episode 2 of our quarterback series, and this one is all about Geno Smith. Paul, how you doing? How you feeling coming off of our first one of these? I think the reception of the first one was pretty great overall.
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised. I wasn't sure if people were going to want to listen to us drone on for an hour about a quarterback that hasn't played for the Jets in 10 years, but I thought the reception was pretty good. It was fun for us, certainly, to take a walk down that memory lane. And I think, being kind of in the low point we are in the season, it sounded like some other people enjoyed it too. So I'm excited to do the rest of these now.
Yeah, and if you haven't listened to that episode yet, go back and listen. It's on the feed under the Other Guys. But just to set the stage of what we're trying to accomplish here before we dive into episode 2, we wanted to, again, go back, as Paul put it, talk about quarterbacks who haven't played in a decade, but we really wanted to go back and look at all of the Jets quarterbacks who were drafted highly and started games for the Jets since this playoff drought has begun. So starting with the Mark Sanchez era, going to Geno for the focus of this episode, and then doing 2 more about Darnold and Wilson, and really taking a holistic view of the situation that they were put in, how the team supported them, and whether or not, the player evaluation of who we thought they were before the draft, if that was accurate, really sort of learn what went into the failures of these 4 Jets quarterbacks and see if there were any trends, any repeatable themes or things that we can look out for from whenever the Jets decide to move on to Aaron Rodgers and restart this cycle over again. So with that being said, obviously, the Geno and Mark Sanchez eras, there's a bit of overlap there. And we covered a lot of the end of Sanchez in the last episode. But Paul, just to reset the stage for all of our listeners here, talk a little bit about what was going on with the Jets prior to Geno's arrival and what situation he found himself coming into.
Yeah, so at the end of the last episode, we really covered it from like a Sanchez centric point of view, and we didn't really zoom out to the whole team. And it's funny, so I went back and revisited the 2012 season again, and so this little snippet is out there on the internet, right? And I'll just read it off. It says, "One of the most turbulent seasons in franchise history. Team was distracted by increased media presence during the offseason due to a quote-unquote quarterback controversy between Mark Sanchez and Tim Tebow. In addition, numerous blunders on and off the field, plus injuries, led to sloppy play, and the team was compared to a circus. Against the Patriots on Thanksgiving, Mark Sanchez fumbled after running into lineman Brandon Moore, was ran back for a touchdown. Game is known as the infamous butt fumble and considered the low point of the season. After that, it was all downhill as the Jets suffered their first losing season since 2007. The Jets offense scored only 281 points, ranking them 30th in the league, while the defense was ranked 8th best in the league." And so that last sentence there really kind of triggered something for me, where that, I think, was the start of this chasm that we've seen develop between the talent on the offense and the talent on the defense and the performance of those 2 units. And it kind of maps out almost exactly with the playoff drought, right? Like, that has been the problem, and it's an offense driven league. And I think you and I talked a lot last time about, at the time Sanchez was here, you kind of could still do that. We were on the tail end of being able to have a run first offense that plays really good defense and being able to have that as a winning brand of football. And then at the end of that, that's when that really tailed off, and we weren't even really able to run the ball anymore. The offensive rankings fell all the way down. The defense started to stay strong. And that kind of started this string of, whether it was Rex, Todd Bowles, we had a little bit of the defense, dip in the defense with Gase, but then we kind of bounced back again with Saleh. That's been where we've been living for the last 10 years, is horrible offense, can't score, can't throw the ball, playing really good defense. So it gives you this false sense like we're actually better than we really are, because occasionally we're keeping games close. And so that was really the start of all that. And just some other notes I made about that season. So Tony Sparano had been brought in to replace Schottenheimer. And there was all this talk in the preseason about, well, how much Wildcat are we going to see? Because that was what Tony Sparano did in Miami when he was the head coach. Like, that was a hot topic in like the the late 2000s, start of the 2010s, was this Wildcat offense. And so I went back and I started just like kind of researching and like trying to remember where we were at that time. And there were articles being written, many articles. You can go see them all about will they or won't they run the Wildcat with Tebow. They chose to be very secretive about it, which is weird. And I had kind of memory holed that until I uncovered all these articles, and they never showed it in the preseason. They performed horribly in the preseason. They went 12 quarters without scoring. Not that it matters, but like people were worried at the time. And they were like refusing to show the real offense. And they kept saying like, oh, well, you'll see in week 1, right? And if you want to have, whatever you would call the opposite of fun, just go Google Jets 2012 Wildcat. There's a bunch of like incredible headlines. My favorite one is, will the launch of the Wildcat be the blast off for Jets offense? And the answer is no. They ended up using it like 3 to 6 times.
No.
Yeah, they used it like 3 to 6 times a game. It was like crazy ineffective. Like it never worked. And eventually later in that year, when Sanchez ended up getting benched, there was a controversy about who he was going to get benched for. And it ended up being Greg McElroy instead of Tebow. And Tebow asked after that, like, basically, I don't want to be used in the offense anymore. Don't use me as a gadget player. Don't put me in the Wildcat. And we didn't see him for the last 4 or 5 weeks of the season because he basically tapped out when he didn't get the starting quarterback, not after Sanchez was benched. And he never saw the field again as a Jet. He was gone the next year. And I remember, like, just every time I come across those 2 Greg McElroy games, the one where he came in relief and won against the Cardinals when Sanchez was playing terribly, and then the following week against the Chargers when he started, I can remember during the Cardinals game texting a buddy of mine who I went to high school with, who also had season tickets near mine. And I just texted him, the Greg McElroy era has begun. And it was like laced with so much sarcasm, like just couldn't believe where we were at, only a couple years removed from being a playoff team. And that season ended with one more Sanchez start because Greg McElroy got a concussion and he couldn't play. But McElroy would have went the rest of the way if he could have. And that was really, like I said earlier, kind of the start of everything that we're still struggling with today. It was a run-first offense in a passing league without a good offensive line. And that gap between the offensive and defensive units really started to develop. And after that, Tannenbaum got fired right at the end of the season. Idzik got hired and Rex was retained, which was not Idzik's call, which then started another big premise of the Badlands docuseries in the first place, which was this wonky reporting structure where you had the GM and the coach reporting separately, both up to Woody and ownership. And so like that kind of like brought us into it. It almost struck me as I laid this all out on paper that like this is kind of the beginning of everything. And me and my brother always joke that like drafting Geno Smith set the team back about 10 years. And by the way, like we were saying that in 2013, we were like, this is a huge mistake. This is going to set the franchise back 10 years. And here we are 11 years later, and we really still haven't recovered. And that was a little bit like, like we were overstating it a little bit, but now 10 years later, when you look back, you're like, this was kind of the start of everything. Like, obviously it crumbled with Sanchez and Tebow, but then like taking this next step, going to Idzik, who was a cap manager, and then like the next series of moves that played out, which we're about to get into, like that's what really kicked off all this shit. And it was painful to go back and look at.
Yeah, so it's been really interesting, like going down memory lane on this for a couple of different reasons. Primarily because, like, when Geno this 2012 season, I was a freshman in college, and I was still in my like I was a diehard Jets fan. We were just coming off obviously like AFC championships back-to-back years in high school, which were some of the formative years of like my fanhood. We've talked about this before on the pod, but I wasn't really an intellectual football fan in the way that I would say that we are now, where we care enough to like do research and dig deep into the sport and like what makes people successful. And I think, one thing that you pointed out from last episode that carries over into this is like, I don't think we fully appreciated at the time just how much had been stripped away from the offense that Sanchez was in when he started. And, how the offensive struggles on that side of the ball led to that. And I think in part, or were caused by that. And I think in part because the 2009 and 2010 defense was the best defense in football, people failed to recognize how well balanced that team was. And as we get into this cycle, as you put it, of having a strong defense and an offense that's bullied by a run game and a passing game that can't compete in today's NFL, I think the vision of what the 2009 2010 teams were is kind of muddled when people say that's the mold we're trying to build this team in. People were not giving that offense enough credit. And, going into the evaluation of Geno as a draft prospect and sort of where I was at this time as, an infancy in my football fandom, so to speak, is I very much remember Greg McElroy coming in, winning with the team, and in that game you put it, and being like, Sanchez is cooked. We need to move on from quarterback. And I know you were saying you were adamantly against drafting Geno, but I vividly remember, being in a faction of Jets fans who were at a bare minimum when he was still there on day two, very tantalized with the Jets taking a quarterback. But going back and doing my research for this, when you look at team fits, there's a lot of people saying the Jets have 2 first-round picks in this draft because we had just traded Darrelle Revis. Geno could be a target for one of those 2 first-round picks. So, the Jets being linked to quarterback, especially with, as you mentioned, a new GM coming into the fold who obviously wants to get his guy. And we've talked ad nauseum on this podcast network about how a terrible idea it was to have a GM come in separately from a head coach. But GM is always going to want to get their guy. So the Jets were in ways linked to quarterback, whether or not the team was necessarily ready to have one. So when you go to look at the evaluation of Geno, just to see what he was in college and whether or not Jets fans and the Jets as a team had a realistic expectation for him. His senior season, and I think part of the reason why there was a faction of Jets fans who very much wanted him, he had a lot of really eye-popping statistical performances. Especially the game I remember most vividly is there was an early or late September game against Baylor. He had 8 touchdowns. It was a 70-63 game. I looked up his stats. He was 45 of 51 for 656 yards. The team started 5-0. And then you got kind of, not necessarily bad Geno, but the team certainly struggled. They went 0-5 after their 5-0 start, finished 7-5. Geno finished the season with 4,200 passing yards, 42 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions, along with 66 carries for 151 yards and 2 touchdowns. And when you look at that from I'm not going to watch the games, I'm going to look at just the stats, that is a eye-popping amount of touchdown to interceptions.
It's ridiculous.
And it really was. And I remember, especially in those first 5 games, Manziel ended up winning the Heisman that year. But there was Geno for Heisman hype, legitimate at the start of that college football season. And Manziel obviously being a true freshman at the time, he was not being talked about in an NFL prospect the way these other guys were, because he no matter what was coming back to school. So, there was a lot of talk about whether or not Geno was QB1 in this class. His player comps at the time were Aaron Brooks, Donovan McNabb, and Matt Ryan.
So weird, dude. That's all over the map.
It's yeah. And to be fair, Ryan was drafted only he was 5 years prior. So, yeah. I mean, even by then, I was going to say, to be fair, they didn't have a lot of his makeup in the NFL. That no, he had played 5 years. It's a very interesting comp. But It says, like Ryan, Smith is the best quarterback in his class, but won't be the first overall pick. It may also take some time for Smith to come into his own. He'll probably never be compared with the top tier quarterbacks in the NFL, but should be a good, dependable signal caller.
Which, by the way, like wasn't Matt Ryan, right? Like Matt
No,
Ryan was fairly
won an
successful
MVP.
fairly quickly. Yeah, exactly. And he was like I mean, he was the definition of a top tier quarterback in the NFL for like a solid 8 years. Like,
Yeah,
so the sentence makes sense about Geno Smith, especially now. Like, especially knowing what we know now that he's like, he's not a bust anymore. Like, he is still
no,
kind of a bust, right? But like, he's carved out an NFL career for himself, not only as a backup, but also as a viable starter. And that sentence, he'll probably never be compared with the top tier quarterbacks in the NFL, but he should be a good, dependable signal caller. It's exactly who he is. It's spot
yeah.
on.
It's a pretty spot on. And I also think if you think of the comps as kind of like a range where it's like Aaron Brooks is the low end, McNabb slash Matt Ryan hybrid is the high end, then it's pretty good from player comp standpoint
Yeah.
because like he didn't quite reach that high ever, but he's on that spectrum and you know with a similar play style. Um so for his strengths, this player comp we looked for Connors. Connors didn't go back as far. We're excited to go back and look at Connors player comps for the last two. Although spoiler alert, I'm sure he will not love us revisiting his Zach Wilson comp because I know he had him as number 2 in his draft. But what are you going to do? Connor wasn't alone there. But this NFL.com strengths for Geno. Competitive, confident player who can lead a team with his physical attributes and willingness to work on his craft. Possesses a quick delivery and can get the ball downfield or move a team methodically by making quick decisions. Has improved accuracy greatly during his career, placing the ball very well at every level of the field. Fires throws into tight windows over the middle while also leading receivers open on the sideline and showing touch on the fades into the end zone. Generally keeps his eyes downfield and feet moving within the pocket to find a target instead of looking to run. Finds the second or third options across the field if the first read is covered. Tests defense with his ability to get first down and more with his feet. Has speed to break off big runs and usually makes the right decision when to take off. Uh, is a tough player who will hang on to the ball after a big hit and bounce back up. So, you know, what I think it's really interesting because going back, I think I had a different imagination of who Geno was in college than a lot of the scouting in the film. And I think part of that was my, insistence on or reluctance to only look at the box score as opposed to diving deeper at the time. Because a lot of the scouting reports, and we'll get to the weaknesses here, but a lot of the scouting reports were he's very accurate in the short to medium, but misses deep on the deep balls and doesn't necessarily have that deep ball accuracy, which wasn't necessarily the impression I got from someone who had, 4,200 yards, 42 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions in his senior year. But from a weakness, runs a spread offense almost exclusively from the shotgun, needs work on his footwork coming from under center. Ball will float or sail if his feet are not set and he fails to transfer weight either in the pocket when facing pressure or when throwing on the run. Blitz awareness is only adequate. Will miss guys coming free to his left and right. Will back up from pressure at times instead of unloading the ball or stepping up to the throw. Seemingly regressed each week, especially when locking onto one side of the field. Did not participate in the Senior Bowl. So I think, there was kind of like this narrative of Geno, especially, we'll get into his draft day slide a little bit, but like the team started out so hot, West Virginia did. And then, once they were hit with adversity, he wasn't like stepping up and making plays. It was sort of like a, have we figured this guy out type of thing. Um, but I think, and we'll get into this in a little bit, but uh, his draft class, when you look back at the draft class, he was either QB1 or QB2. There is no question that Geno Smith is QB1 of this draft class. Like it, and that says so much about the quality of quarterback prospect in this draft. Is EJ Manuel, I think, was the only first round pick taken.
Yeah. And
Uh,
Geno went like 30 picks after EJ Manuel. Wasn't even close.
Yeah, it was. I think EJ went 16th, right, and Geno went 39th. But like, yeah, just an atrocious quarterback draft. Um, and when you put that in context, like, I think one of the things, especially now, and we'll get to this later in quarterbacks, but I think a lot of the Geno, um, and we didn't have this in this report, but some of the reports I read were like, he is someone who will need to take time to mature coming into an NFL offense. And I think uh, during draft season, there's a lot of times when there are red flags on guys and all this stuff, but the NFL media machine, which was really getting active during this time period where the draft was becoming a cottage industry, will have an impact where like they will push quarterbacks up the board because teams like talking about quarterbacks. And I do think, the Pat Mahomes effect of young guys coming into the league and being so successful right away has absolutely contributed to shifting guys up the board. Um, but, you know,
JJ
I
McCarthy is a
feel
great example from this year.
right, right. But with all that being said, I think there were a lot of pretty much red flags with Geno in terms of his readiness, and his ceiling of, this guy is going to be a good guy, but not necessarily, a top tier guy. Um, and I think they were pretty accurate long term with who Geno Smith ended up being once he found the right situation. Now, Geno is a unique case because he was a cat who had 9 lives and bounced around as a backup and eventually won a starting job and like put together a good season 7 years into his NFL career. Had Geno's career ended as a backup with the Giants, we would be talking about these evaluations very differently. So that is, I think, a major caveat when it comes to Geno Smith. All of that being said, um, we're going to get into how the Jets supported him, but he ended up going in the second round. Um, and, this is where my memory gets hazy about whether I wanted Geno from the jump in the draft or only when he became available on a day 2 pick. But with all the context that we have with, the situation that the Jets were in, do I think the team was necessarily ready to have a quarterback right away? No. Do I think, or like ready to draft a quarterback who was going to be your day 1 starter that season? No, I do not think that this was a team that needed to go out and do that. Do I like taking the swing on this kind of a prospect after you've already had 2 first-round picks and he falls to you at pick 39 on day 2? I kind of do like that process. So like I wouldn't have taken D Milner at 9, but revisiting this Jets draft, it's not like I would say they misread the quarterback evaluation. They ended up getting the best quarterback in this draft. And I don't necessarily think for how he was evaluated, pick 39 was too steep for him.
Yeah, no, I reluctantly agree with you. So part of
Which
my
just to before we get into this, Paul was like one of the biggest Geno Jets haters of all time.
yeah.
So this exercise is working and changing our opinions because the fact that you just said that into a microphone is unbelievable.
Yeah, I was texting Jake all this week. I was like, this one's gonna be tough. Like, I'm probably gonna say a lot of mean stuff. Like, I really, really don't like Geno. I've softened up on him over time, and I'll explain why later. But when he was here, like, visceral dislike for it. And I think for me, not to turn this into a therapy session, but part of it was definitely like it was lingering Sanchez stuff. And I experienced the same thing from the Darnold to Wilson move, whereas like there was so much investment in a player that it was difficult to move forward when I didn't feel like it was time yet and the team felt like it was time yet. And so it was a bad foot right off the jump with Geno. And a couple other things I wanted to throw in, like we did this at the top of the Sanchez episode and we forgot to do it this time, but like we have that chart that we have to tweet out still of the comparing the 4 quarterbacks over their first 3 seasons against each other. And, you asked me what stood out about Sanchez. And I just went back and I looked at Geno, and what stood out to him was that he was actually worse than I remembered. I think part of like part of his process in the NFL and his story and what he's been able to rebuild almost obscures how bad he was here. And also, there were a couple really good moments here. Like, he played a couple really, really good games. The one against the Packers really stands out to me. We'll talk about that more later. But really, he's kind of at the bottom of the barrel in all of these categories except yards per attempt and the 2 rushing categories. Everything else, he's losing to all 3 of these quarterbacks in, which is pretty stunning to look back on. The other thing that stood out about all the draft analysis was like, it's one of those things where you can't zero in on it and in the moment because it's in the midst of so much other information. But it's like, knowing what we know now, you can go back and you can find the Easter eggs that are just laying throughout this analysis. Like, you see this word regression pop up a couple times. You see reverted popping up a couple times. You see, he kind of, when he faces a little bit of pressure, he kind of shrinks. He doesn't feel it coming from the sides. He took a couple massive hits when he was with the Jets. That was partly because the offensive line was not very good, but also because he just wouldn't see it coming, dude. Like, he had no feel for who was coming at him. And, that one line at the end of the weaknesses section, where it says that, he locks onto people, he sails the ball if there's a little bit of pressure coming, he misses people coming free. That's all stuff we saw. But then the last sentence is that he didn't participate in the Senior Bowl. And essentially that was because he had a bad end to the season and he didn't want to make things worse anymore. And so rather than kind of like leaning into the adversity that he was facing, he just kind of like let it dictate what he was doing. And I remember on draft night, you're talking about how you started to really want the quarterback once he fell into the 30s. I remember on draft night, like, they took D. Milliner, they took Sheldon Richardson with the pick we got for Revis. And I remember they just kept showing Geno in that goddamn white sweater he was wearing. And they just kept showing him. And he was so pissed off. And it just felt like a freight train was bearing down on us. Like, our pick was getting closer. They just kept showing Geno. They kept saying, maybe it's the Jets, maybe it's the Jets. And then it happened. And for me, it was just like, oh, fuck, man. Like, here we go again. Now we're going to have another, like, we had just had the Tebow Sanchez controversy the previous summer. Now we're going to have a Sanchez Geno Smith controversy. And I just remember, like, man, like, I had bad feelings from it right out of the gate. And so, whatever, we do take them and we try to start moving pieces around, right? And so it's Idzik and it's Rex working together. I still am dying to know what that working relationship was like, but they bring in David Lee as the quarterback coach. And that was presumably for Mark too, right? Because Mark Sanchez was still there. And I'm not positive that the plan was for Geno to start right out of the gate. And so they bring in David Lee as the quarterback coach, who at the time was pretty respected. He had been kind of credited with helping Pennington rebuild his career for that 1 year in Miami. He's an old Parcells disciple, so that Parcells DNA was still kind of like floating around the Jets. Every time we got a Parcells guy, we would be very excited about it. They brought in Marty Morningweg to be an offensive coordinator, which at the time was like, we're bringing an adult into the room because Schottenheimer didn't know what he was doing. He was a kid. And so, like, I think the plan was probably for him to sit behind Sanchez for at least part of the year. I don't know if they thought Sanchez could have another whole year, but I think they at least wanted to let Geno watch for a little bit. And Sanchez was winning the competition in the preseason. Like, he was playing better. Geno looked horrible. And then we have, again, we're overlapping with the last episode here, but we had the Mark Sanchez, the injury and garbage time there. And that kind of put us in the position where Geno had to go, right?
We didn't talk about this, I think, in depth enough on the last episode, just how dumb of a coaching move it was from Rex. Like, not only did it not make any sense to, like, in the fourth, was it the fourth or the third? It was the fourth, right? Because it was the Giants, right?
Yeah, it was, third preseason game, fourth quarter. Yeah.
Okay. But so it was the third preseason game. I thought it was maybe the fourth preseason game, but even still, the third preseason game, traditionally the dress rehearsal, that has really gone away in, NFL circles, especially now that the preseason is even shorter. But to say openly, yeah, we don't know who our quarterback is enough, and this fourth quarter of a preseason game might be the tipping point, is like so astronomically bad mismanagement that I think it's really emblematic of the type of situation that Geno found himself in the first year. Like, the only reason you're starting is because your head coach played the starting quarterback in the fourth quarter of a meaningless preseason game, and now you're our guy.
It's a visible sign of the dysfunction. And I think the inability of Rex and Idzik to work together, where Rex thought that that might be what he needed to do to get his guy to the finish line of winning the starting job, was let me put him in and let him shine against a bunch of scrubs that aren't even going to make the Giants team, right? Who have nothing to, like, they have everything to play for, so they have nothing to lose. They're going crazy out there. They're laying hits like it's the Super Bowl and it's a preseason game. And I think it's a signal of how bad the dysfunction was and how bad that working relationship was. And so, that all happens. And then as far as like what they did to kind of change the team around him from that previous 2012 team that was so bad, like, they lost Sean Green. They bring in Chris Ivory to replace him via trade with the Saints. But like, the wide receiver core was terrible. Santonio Holmes played 11 games that year, but he had fewer receptions than, listen to this list. Santonio Holmes, 11 games. He had 23 receptions, which was fewer than Curley, Bilal Powell, Jeff Cumberland, Kellen Winslow, David Nelson, Stephen Hill. All had more receptions than Santonio Holmes, right? And the season, like, it wasn't as much of an abject disaster as you might think, right? Like, they actually did okay. He had kind of a signature win in week 5. He threw for 203 touchdowns. I think it was a Monday Night Football game against the Falcons. I remember I was commuting into work in New York City at the time, and it was like when live billboards started to become a thing, where they were screens instead of like painted signs. And they had like a picture of Rex like celebrating the win in the Falcons on the Tuesday morning, the day after. But like, as the season kind of wore on, things started to devolve a little bit, and he was benched in week 13 for Matt Sims, which, like, again, totally memory hold that Matt Sims had played for the Jets and at one point was a starting quarterback for the Jets. And like, again, was not totally what you wouldn't expect from a year with a rookie quarterback, right? It was like kind of normal at the time. But it really kind of came off the rails in 2014. Like, things got bad. It started with, the infamous Idzik 12 draft, which I put in a graphic for us here to reference very quickly. And I don't want to spend a ton of time on the Idzik 12 because it's so horrible. But let me just read off the names and the number of career games they all played in the NFL. First round pick, Calvin Pryor, 38 games. Second round pick, Jason Morrow, 17 games. Third round pick, Dexter McDougal, 31 games. Fourth round pick, Jalen Saunders, 15 games. Fourth round pick, Shaq Evans, 0 NFL games. Fourth round pick, Dakota Dozier, 37. Fifth, Jeremiah George, 37. Sixth, Brandon Dixon, 19. Sixth, Quincy Enunwa, the only good pick in this draft, 40. Sixth, IK Enampali, who we'll come back to later for obvious reasons, 17 games. Sixth, Taj Boyd, 0 games. 7, Trevor Riley, 37 games. So that's like really where it started to go off the rails, is in between the 2013 and the 2014 season. They cut Mark Sanchez. They signed Mike Vick off the Eagles in a corresponding move, which at the time was a mentor Geno, help Geno out thing, became something else entirely later. But the jewel of that offseason was signing Eric Decker to a 5-year deal. That was like, okay, like, you got the kid a receiver. Santonio Holmes contributed nothing and he's gone now. We brought in Eric Decker, young up-and-coming receiver coming off his rookie contract with the Broncos. And then they also traded for Percy Harvin early in the next season, which at the time felt like a great move, didn't turn out too well. And they also brought in Chris Johnson, CJ2K, from the Titans to continue our streak of bringing in aging running backs. And so going into year 2, like, I guess I'm like trying to put myself back in those shoes and remember what the feeling was like. But they actually started off kind of okay. They opened with a win, and they had that Packers game that I referred to earlier was week 2, and Geno had a really, really good performance, and he threw a game tying touchdown pass in the final minutes to Jeremy Curley. But if you remember, Marty Morningweg had called a timeout right before the snap. And so the play got nullified, and Rex, after the game, all the questions were like, who called the timeout? Why'd you call the timeout? Rex denied it. He said he had nothing to do with it. He didn't even know a timeout was being called. And then everybody was grilling Marty Morningweg, saying, I remember he was like, I called the play. I liked the play. And then I saw the defensive formation and I wanted to check out of it. Geno didn't check out, so I called a timeout. And like I said, Geno threw a touchdown pass to Curley on that play. It got nullified. They lost to Aaron Rodgers and the Packers. And then they never really